Alright, so today we're talking about something that's been making headlines around the world, tensions involving Iran, and the question we're exploring is not whether people agree with everything Iran does politically, because that's a completely different debate, but rather why the world should oppose aggression against any sovereign country, including Iran. Let's break this down. First, there's the issue of international law. After the devastation of World War II, the global community created rules through the United Nations Charter to prevent wars of aggression. One of the core principles is simple. Countries should not attack other countries unless it's clearly self-defense or authorized by the international community. When this rule is ignored, it weakens the system meant to keep global peace. And here's the thing. When the rules don't apply equally to everyone, the entire international system starts to crumble. If powerful nations can bypass those rules, then smaller or weaker countries may feel that the only way to survive is through militarization or alliances that increase tensions worldwide. Second, there's the risk of escalation. The Middle East is one of the most strategically sensitive regions on Earth. Iran sits at the center of important trade routes, energy supplies, and regional alliances. If a conflict involving Iran expands, it could draw in multiple countries and destabilize the entire region. History has shown that wars in this region rarely stay contained. Third, we need to talk about ordinary people. In conflicts like these, civilians usually suffer the most. Economic sanctions, military strikes, and instability can disrupt healthcare, education, food supply, and basic security. Whether someone supports or opposes the Iranian government, millions of ordinary people in Iran would face the consequences of war. Fourth, there's the importance of diplomacy. Many experts argue that diplomatic negotiations, however slow or frustrating, are still far safer than military confrontation. Dialogue allows countries to manage disputes, reduce misunderstandings, and prevent conflicts that could spiral out of control. Supporting Iran against aggression isn't necessarily about supporting a government or its policies. Instead, it's about defending a principle that international conflicts should be resolved through law, negotiation, and diplomacy rather than force. Because if the world abandons that principle, then no country, large or small, is truly safe. And that's really the key takeaway: supporting peace, sovereignty, and diplomacy isn't just about Iran. It's about protecting the rules that help prevent global conflict. One of the most important principles in international relations is the idea of sovereignty. Sovereignty means that every country has the right to govern itself without outside interference. This principle has become a cornerstone of modern global politics, especially after the devastation of the 20th century's world wars. When people talk about respecting sovereignty, they are talking about the idea that each nation, large or small, powerful or weak, has the right to control its own territory, its own political system, and its own national decisions without being threatened or attacked by others. After the end of the Second World War, the international community attempted to create a system that would prevent the kinds of destructive conflicts that had devastated millions of lives. One of the main results of this effort was the creation of the United Nations. The United Nations established a framework of international law that emphasized peace, cooperation, and the prevention of aggression between states. A key part of that framework is the rule that countries should not use military force against other countries unless there is a legitimate reason recognized by international law. This principle is written clearly in the Charter of the United Nations, which discourages the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. In simple terms, it means that countries should not attack each other or attempt to control another nation's territory or government through military pressure. The idea behind this rule is not just moral or philosophical, it is practical. When nations respect sovereignty, the chances of global war are reduced because countries know their borders and independence are protected by widely accepted international norms. In the context of global politics, the issue of respecting sovereignty becomes particularly important when discussing tensions involving Iran. Like any other recognized state, Iran is a member of the United Nations and therefore has the same legal rights and responsibilities as other countries under international law. Whether other nations agree or disagree with Iran's policies, the principle of sovereignty suggests that disputes should be handled through diplomacy, negotiation, and international institutions rather than military aggression. The reason this principle matters so much is because it creates stability. If countries begin to ignore sovereignty whenever they disagree with another government's actions or policies, it opens the door to constant conflict. Imagine a world where powerful countries could attack weaker ones whenever political tensions arise. In such a system, international order would quickly break down, and global security would become unpredictable and dangerous. Respecting sovereignty also protects smaller or less powerful nations from domination. Not every country has the same military strength or economic power. International law exists partly to ensure that global politics is not simply controlled by the strongest states. Instead, it creates rules that apply to everyone equally. When these rules are respected, it sends a message that disputes should be resolved through legal and diplomatic channels rather than violence. Another important aspect of sovereignty is national self-determination. This concept means that the people of a country have the right to decide their own political future. Outside military intervention can disrupt this process by imposing external influence on domestic political systems. When sovereignty is respected, it allows societies to develop their institutions and political structures according to their own choices and cultural contexts. From an educational perspective, understanding sovereignty helps people see international conflicts in a broader way. Rather than focusing only on short-term political disagreements, it encourages thinking about long-term global stability. The idea is that when nations consistently respect each other's independence and territorial boundaries, the risk of destructive wars decreases significantly. In discussions about global security, sovereignty therefore remains one of the most fundamental principles shaping how countries interact with one another. It represents a commitment to peaceful coexistence, legal frameworks, and mutual respect among nations, forming a foundation for diplomatic solutions instead of military confrontation. International law plays a central role in shaping how countries interact with each other, especially when it comes to the use of military force. One of the most important legal frameworks governing relations between nations is the Charter of the United Nations. After the devastation of the Second World War, world leaders recognized that a system of shared rules was necessary to prevent future global conflicts. The United Nations was created not only to encourage cooperation among countries, but also to establish legal boundaries that discourage aggression and protect international stability. One of the most important rules in this framework appears in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. This article states that all member states should refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any other state. In simpler terms, it means that countries are not supposed to attack or threaten other countries unless there is a legitimate justification recognized by international law. The purpose of this rule is to prevent wars of aggression and encourage peaceful methods for resolving disputes. Before the creation of the United Nations system, international relations were often dominated by military power. Stronger nations could impose their will on weaker ones through invasions, territorial expansion, or coercion. This approach created instability because conflicts were frequently resolved through warfare rather than negotiation. The global community realized that without clear rules, the cycle of aggression would continue indefinitely. By establishing legal principles that limit the use of force, the United Nations attempted to replace power-based politics with a rules-based international order. The prohibition against the use of force does not mean that countries can never defend themselves. International law recognizes the right of self-defense if a country is attacked. In such situations, state may use force to protect its citizens and territory. However, the key idea is that military action should only occur under specific legal conditions, not simply because of political disagreements or strategic competition. This distinction is important because it separates legitimate defense from aggression. Another mechanism created under the United Nations system is the role of the Security Council. The Security Council has the authority to determine whether a threat to international peace exists and to decide what action should be taken. These actions can include sanctions, diplomatic pressure, peacekeeping missions, or in extreme cases, collective military intervention authorized by the international community. The goal is to ensure that decisions about the use of force are made collectively rather than unilaterally by individual states. In discussions about international tensions involving Iran, these legal principles often become part of the debate. Iran, like other countries, is a member of the United Nations and therefore operates within the same international legal framework. When disputes arise between Iran and other states, international law emphasizes that disagreements should ideally be addressed through diplomatic negotiations, international courts, or multilateral institutions rather than through direct military confrontation. Respecting these legal rules is important because it helps maintain predictability in global affairs. Countries are more likely to cooperate and resolve disputes peacefully when they believe that international law will be applied consistently. If powerful states ignore these rules whenever it suits their interests, it can weaken the credibility of the entire system. Other countries may begin to question whether international law truly protects them, which could encourage military buildups or regional alliances designed for self-protection. International law also provides tools for mediation and conflict resolution. Organizations within the United Nations system facilitate dialogue between nations, helping them negotiate solutions to disputes before they escalate into violence. Diplomatic channels, economic agreements, and international monitoring mechanisms all play roles in reducing tensions and building trust among states. Understanding the importance of Article 2 and the broader principles of the United Nations Charter helps explain why many policymakers and scholars emphasize the value of legal frameworks in international relations. These rules were designed to create a global environment where conflicts are addressed through negotiation, legal reasoning, and collective decision-making rather than unilateral military force. When discussing tensions involving Iran, one of the most important concerns raised by analysts and policymakers is the risk of escalation into a wider regional conflict. The Middle East is one of the most politically and strategically complex regions in the world. Many countries in the region are connected through alliances, security agreements, economic partnerships, and long-standing political rivalries. Because of this network of relationships, a conflict involving one major state can quickly spread beyond its borders and draw multiple nations into the situation. Iran occupies a particularly significant position in the region. It has a large population, substantial natural resources, and influence in several regional political and security dynamics. Its geographic location is also strategically important, sitting near major trade routes and waterways that are essential for global commerce and energy transportation. Because of these factors, any serious military conflict involving Iran could affect not only its immediate neighbors, but also the broader international community. One of the key geographic features connected to Iran's strategic importance is the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow passage connects the Persian Gulf to international waters and is used by a significant portion of the world's oil shipments. Many countries rely on energy resources transported through this route. If a conflict were to disrupt traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, it could affect global energy markets, trade flows, and economic stability across multiple continents. Another factor that increases the risk of escalation is the presence of numerous regional alliances and security relationships. Several countries in the Middle East maintain close partnerships with global powers or regional coalitions. If military tensions involving Iran were to intensify, allied states might feel pressure to support their partners. This could transform a localized conflict into a much larger confrontation involving several countries at once. The Middle East has experienced multiple conflicts over the past several decades, and history shows that wars in the region rarely remain limited to a single battlefield. Political rivalries, sectarian divisions, and competing geopolitical interests often intersect in ways that expand conflicts beyond their original scope. In such an environment, even small incidents, such as border clashes, attacks on infrastructure, misunderstandings between military forces, can rapidly escalate into larger confrontations. Another concern frequently discussed by experts is the presence of non-state actors and proxy groups throughout the region. These organizations sometimes operate independently, but are also connected to broader political and military dynamics. When tensions rise between states, proxy groups can become involved in conflicts, which complicates efforts to control escalation. Their participation can open additional fronts in a conflict and increase the number of actors involved. Economic consequences are also an important part of the escalation risk. Military conflict in a region as economically interconnected as the Middle East can disrupt trade routes, investment flows, and infrastructure. Energy markets in particular are sensitive to instability in this area because several major oil-producing countries are located there. When tensions increase, global energy prices often fluctuate, which can affect economies far beyond the region itself. Diplomatic experts often emphasize that escalation risks are one of the strongest arguments for pursuing negotiation and conflict prevention strategies. Preventing conflict is generally easier and less costly than attempting to control it after it begins. Diplomatic communication channels, international mediation, and regional dialogue mechanisms are frequently used in an effort to reduce misunderstandings and manage tensions before they turn into open confrontation. Understanding the potential for escalation helps explain why international observers closely monitor developments involving Iran and its neighbors. Because the region contains so many interconnected political, economic, and security relationships, changes in one area can quickly influence the stability of the broader Middle East and the global system connected to it. One of the most significant consequences of international conflict is its impact on ordinary civilians. When tensions escalate between governments, the people who often suffer the most are not political leaders or military officials, but everyday citizens trying to live their lives. Families, workers, students, and elderly people frequently experience the direct effects of instability through economic hardship, disrupted services, and insecurity. Understanding this human dimension is essential when discussing the potential consequences of aggression against a country such as Iran. Military conflict can affect civilian populations in many ways. One of the most immediate effects is damage to infrastructure. Roads, bridges, hospitals, power stations, and communication systems are essential for the functioning of modern societies. During military confrontations, these structures can be damaged or destroyed, either intentionally or as unintended consequences of combat operations. When infrastructure stops functioning properly, daily life becomes much more difficult for millions of people. Healthcare systems are particularly vulnerable during periods of conflict. Hospitals may struggle to obtain medical supplies, equipment, and trained personnel. Transportation disruptions can make it harder for patients to reach healthcare facilities. In addition, medical professionals often face overwhelming workloads as they attempt to treat both routine illnesses and injuries caused by violence. In many conflicts around the world, weakened healthcare systems have resulted in long-term public health challenges that continue long after the fighting ends. Economic disruptions are another major concern for civilian populations. International tensions often lead to economic sanctions, trade restrictions, or financial isolation. While these measures are usually intended to pressure governments, they frequently have widespread consequences for ordinary people. Businesses may struggle to import necessary materials, factories may slow production, and workers may lose their jobs. As employment opportunities decline, household incomes can fall dramatically. Sanctions and economic isolation can also influence the cost and availability of everyday goods. When imports become limited or supply chains are disrupted, essential items such as medicine, fuel, and food may become more expensive or harder to obtain. Families with limited financial resources are especially vulnerable in these situations because they may already be struggling to meet basic needs. Even moderate price increases can create significant challenges for households living on tight budgets. Education systems can also be affected by prolonged instability. Schools and universities rely on consistent funding, functioning infrastructure, and safe environments for students and teachers. When political tensions lead to economic decline or security concerns, educational institutions may face interruptions. Students might miss months or even years of learning opportunities, which can have long-term effects on their personal development and career prospects. Psychological stress is another important factor when civilians live under the threat of conflict. Constant uncertainty about safety, employment, and access to essential services can create widespread anxiety within communities. Families may worry about the future of their children, their financial security, and their overall well-being. Over time, these pressures can influence mental health across large segments of the population. Cultural and social life can also change significantly during periods of international tension. Public events, travel, tourism, and cultural exchanges often decline when instability increases. Communities that once depended on tourism or international cooperation may lose valuable opportunities for economic growth and cultural interaction. These changes can isolate societies and reduce the connections that help people understand and cooperate with others around the world. Humanitarian organizations frequently emphasize the importance of protecting civilian populations during times of political conflict. International agreements such as the Geneva Conventions outline rules intended to reduce harm to civilians during warfare. These agreements stress the need to distinguish between military targets and civilian infrastructure, and they encourage the protection of medical personnel, humanitarian workers, and non-combatants. Examining conflicts through the perspective of civilian impact highlights the broader humanitarian consequences of aggression and instability. Military strategies, political disputes, and international rivalries may dominate headlines, but the long-term social and economic effects often shape the daily lives of millions of people who have little influence over the political decisions that lead to conflict. Diplomacy has long been one of the most important tools used by countries to manage disagreements and prevent conflicts from turning into wars. In international relations, diplomacy refers to the process of negotiation, dialogue, and communication between governments in order to resolve disputes peacefully. Instead of relying on military force, diplomacy focuses on discussion, compromise, and cooperation. When tensions arise between nations, diplomatic channels provide a structured way for leaders and representatives to address problems without escalating them into violence. Throughout modern history, diplomatic negotiations have helped prevent many potential conflicts from becoming large-scale wars. Governments often use embassies, international organizations, and special envoys to communicate with one another even during periods of serious disagreement. These diplomatic structures allow countries to clarify their intentions, reduce misunderstandings, and explore possible solutions. In many cases, conflicts begin not because countries intentionally want war, but because of miscommunication, mistrust, or competing interpretations of events. Diplomatic dialogue can help reduce these risks by encouraging transparency and ongoing conversation. One of the main institutions involved in international diplomacy is the United Nations. The United Nations provides forums where representatives from different countries can meet, discuss global issues, and negotiate agreements. Through meetings of the General Assembly, the Security Council, and various diplomatic committees, governments are able to present their concerns and attempt to reach peaceful resolutions. The existence of such international platforms encourages states to address disputes through conversation rather than confrontation. Diplomacy is also supported by international agreements and treaties that establish frameworks for cooperation. For example, negotiations between world powers and Iran have often focused on complex issues related to security, technology, and regional stability. One notable example is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, an international agreement that involved several countries working together to address concerns related to nuclear development. The negotiations that produced this agreement required years of diplomatic discussions, technical analysis, and compromise between multiple governments. Diplomatic agreements like this demonstrate how negotiation can provide alternatives to military escalation. Instead of attempting to resolve disagreements through force, countries can work together to establish rules, monitoring systems, and verification mechanisms. These arrangements may not eliminate all tensions, but they can create structured processes that reduce uncertainty and build confidence among participating nations. Another important feature of diplomacy is the involvement of mediators. In situations where two countries find it difficult to communicate directly, third parties can sometimes help facilitate discussions. Neutral states, international organizations, or experienced diplomats may act as intermediaries who help both sides understand each other's concerns. Mediation can be especially useful when trust between conflicting parties is low because it allows negotiations to continue in a more balanced environment. Diplomacy also extends beyond formal negotiations between governments. Cultural exchanges, academic cooperation, economic partnerships, and international conferences can all contribute to building relationships between societies. When people from different countries interact through education, trade, and cultural activities, it can strengthen mutual understanding and reduce the likelihood of conflict. These forms of soft diplomacy often operate quietly in the background but can play an important role in shaping long-term international cooperation. In many global crises, diplomats work continuously behind the scenes to prevent situations from escalating further. They may hold private meetings, draft proposals, and communicate with multiple governments simultaneously in order to identify solutions that are acceptable to all parties involved. This process can be slow and sometimes frustrating, but it often provides a path toward compromise that avoids the destruction and instability associated with armed conflict. Diplomacy, therefore, represents a critical component of international stability. By encouraging negotiation, dialogue, and cooperation, it offers countries a way to manage disagreements and pursue their interests without resorting to violence or military confrontation. In international relations, actions taken by powerful countries often set examples that influence how other states behave. This idea is commonly referred to as precedent. A precedent is an action or decision that establishes a pattern which others may follow in the future. When discussing conflicts between nations, the precedents created by military interventions or aggressive policies can shape the behavior of governments across the world. Because of this, many scholars and policymakers pay close attention to how international rules are applied in situations involving countries such as Iran. The global system that governs relations between states is largely built on shared expectations about acceptable behavior. These expectations are supported by international agreements, diplomatic traditions, and legal frameworks developed after major historical events. One of the most important of these frameworks is the Charter of the United Nations, which established rules designed to discourage wars of aggression and encourage peaceful conflict resolution. When countries follow these rules consistently, they reinforce a predictable system in which states understand the limits of acceptable conduct. However, when major powers act outside of these rules, it can weaken the credibility of the entire system. Other governments may observe these actions and conclude that international norms are flexible or selectively enforced. This can create a dangerous cycle in which countries begin to justify their own aggressive policies by pointing to previous examples set by others. Over time, the repeated violation of international norms can erode the trust that holds the global system together. The issue of precedent is particularly important because international law does not function in the same way as domestic law within a single country. There is no global government with absolute authority over all nations. Instead, the international system relies heavily on cooperation, mutual recognition of rules, and pressure from other states to encourage compliance. If the most powerful actors ignore these rules without facing consequences, it may encourage others to do the same. A historical example that demonstrates the importance of precedent is the Iraq War. This conflict sparked widespread debate among scholars and policymakers about the interpretation of international law and the legitimacy of military intervention. Supporters argued that the war addressed security concerns, while critics claimed it weakened international legal norms related to the use of force. Regardless of the perspective taken, the event illustrated how major military actions can shape global discussions about what behaviors are considered acceptable in international relations. When precedents are established through military interventions, other states may adjust their own security strategies in response. Some governments might increase military spending, develop new defense alliances, or invest in advanced weapons technologies to protect themselves. These reactions can contribute to arms races or heightened tensions between neighboring countries. In regions that are already politically sensitive, such changes can increase the risk of future conflicts. Precedents can also influence how smaller or less powerful states view their position in the international system. If they believe that international rules will not protect them from aggression, they may feel pressure to seek stronger alliances with larger powers. This can lead to the formation of competing blocs or geopolitical rivalries, which historically have been associated with periods of global instability. In discussions about potential conflicts involving Iran, some analysts emphasize the importance of maintaining consistent international standards. They argue that decisions made in one situation may affect how future disputes are handled elsewhere. If the principle that countries should not be attacked without clear legal justification is weakened in one case, it may be harder to defend that principle in another situation involving a different state. Because of these concerns, the concept of precedent plays a significant role in debates about international security and diplomacy. Policymakers often consider not only the immediate consequences of their actions, but also the long-term signals those actions send to the rest of the world. These signals can influence how other nations interpret international rules, respond to conflicts, and shape their own strategies within the global political system. When we step back and look at all these points together, a larger picture begins to emerge. The issue is not simply about one country or one moment in time. It is about the broader principles that shape how the international community chooses to deal with conflict, disagreement, and power. In today's interconnected world, decisions made in one region can influence stability, security, and economic conditions across the globe. Because of this, the way nations respond to tensions involving Iran carries implications that extend far beyond a single political dispute. Respect for sovereignty, adherence to international law, concern for civilian populations, and the commitment to diplomatic solutions all reflect the same underlying goal: maintaining a global system where disputes are addressed through cooperation rather than confrontation. These principles were developed over decades of international experience, particularly after the destructive conflicts of the 20th century. Institutions such as the United Nations were created specifically to encourage dialogue and prevent aggressive actions that could destabilize entire regions. History has repeatedly shown that military escalation rarely produces simple solutions. Conflicts often expand, drawing in additional actors and creating long-term consequences that affect millions of lives. Economic disruption, humanitarian suffering, and regional instability frequently follow in the wake of armed confrontations. By contrast, diplomatic engagement, though sometimes slow and complicated, offers opportunities to reduce tensions, clarify misunderstandings, and build agreements that can manage disagreements peacefully. Another key lesson from international relations is that actions taken by powerful countries shape global expectations. When the rules of the international system are applied consistently, they strengthen trust between nations and encourage cooperation. When those rules are ignored or selectively applied, it can weaken confidence in the system and encourage other states to act outside established norms. Maintaining fairness and consistency in international law therefore becomes essential for preserving stability. At the same time, focusing on the human dimension of conflict reminds us that political decisions have real consequences for ordinary people. Civilians often experience the greatest hardships during times of war or economic isolation. Protecting communities, infrastructure, education systems, and healthcare services requires careful consideration of the long-term impact of geopolitical strategies. For these reasons, discussions about global tensions should not only focus on immediate political disagreements, but also on the larger principles that guide international cooperation. Encouraging diplomacy, respecting sovereignty, and prioritizing peaceful conflict resolution helps create an environment where countries can address disputes without causing widespread destruction or instability. In the broader perspective of global security, supporting peaceful solutions and opposing aggression contributes to a more stable and predictable international order. Such an approach emphasizes dialogue, law, and cooperation as the foundations for resolving disagreements among nations and maintaining long-term peace in an increasingly interconnected world.